In January of 1889, the town of Bitter Creek, Wyoming learned what happens when a corrupt sheriff mistakes a widow's quiet strength for weakness. Cora James had buried her husband just 3 months earlier, tending his grave through the first snows, while Sheriff Wade Donovan circled her homestead like a hungry wolf. When Donovan finally made his move demanding marriage as payment for protection, Cora's refusal cost her everything she owned, dumped in the frozen street during the worst blizzard in 20 years. But sometimes the cruelest winter's birth, the most unexpected warmth. On that same bitter road where Cora trudged toward exile, a lonely trail boss named Emmett Cole was making his own peace with solitude. What neither expected was how quickly two wounded hearts could recognize each other in a howling storm. Would a marriage born of desperation have any chance of becoming something real? Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from. And if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. The wind that January morning carried the scent of snow and wood smoke through the valley, though Cora James barely noticed as she stood at her kitchen window, watching the grey sky promise another storm. 3 months had passed since she'd laid Samuel to rest in the small cemetery overlooking Bitter Creek, and the silence in their cabin had become a living thing, pressing against her shoulders like an unwelcome shawl. She turned from the window and surveyed the kitchen that had once been filled with Samuel's laughter and the comfortable sounds of a shared life. The cast-iron stove still radiated warmth, the pine table still bore the ring marks from Samuel's coffee cup, and the yellow curtains she'd sewn their first spring here still caught what little light the cloudy day offered. Yet everything felt diminished, as if the very walls had shrunk without Samuel's presence to fill them. Cora's fingers found the simple gold band on her left hand, Samuel's wedding gift to her 26 years ago, when they'd married in Ohio, before heading west to claim their piece of Wyoming territory. The metal was warm from her touch, worn smooth from decades of wear, and she twisted it gently as she'd taken to doing when the loneliness pressed too hard. Some of the church ladies had suggested she remove it, that holding onto such symbols wasn't healthy for a woman her age. But Cora wasn't ready to let go of the last, tangible connection to the man who'd been her partner in everything from dawn chores to evening prayers. The homestead stretched 160 acres along Willow Creek, good grazing land with a reliable water source that Samuel had chosen with his usual careful eye. They'd built the cabin themselves that first summer, Samuel handling the heavy work, while Cora chinked the gaps and planned where her garden would go. The barn came next, then the chicken coop, then the small corral where they'd kept the horses and the milk cow. Every board, every nail had been placed with intention and hope for the future they were building together. Now that future felt as fragile as the ice forming along the creek's edges. Cora wrapped her woolen shawl tighter around her shoulders and stepped out onto the covered porch. The morning air bit at her cheeks, but she needed to check on the animals before the next wave of snow arrived. The chickens huddled in their coop, feathers fluffed against the cold, while Bessie the cow stood patiently in the barn, her breath creating small clouds in the frigid air. These daily routines had become Cora's anchor, the familiar tasks that gave shape to days that otherwise threatened to drift by unmarked. "Morning, ladies," she murmured to the chickens as she scattered feed from the tin bucket. "Looks like we're in for another rough one." The hens clucked their acknowledgement, pecking at the scattered grain with the focused determination of creatures who understood the importance of taking sustenance when it was offered. Cora envied them their simple certainty, their ability to find purpose in the immediate needs of survival. After tending the animals, she walked the familiar path to Samuel's grave. The wooden marker she'd carved herself bore his name, the dates of his birth and death, and the simple words, "Beloved husband." Wildflowers would bloom. Here comes spring, she'd planted them last fall, but now only dried stems poked through the crusted snow, like thin fingers reaching toward a grey sky. "Sheriff came by again yesterday," she told the headstone, her voice carrying easily in the still air. "Same nonsense about needing protection out here alone." I told him what I tell him every time: I've got the Lord's protection and my own good sense, and that's sufficient. But even as she spoke the words, Cora felt a chill that had nothing to do with the weather. Sheriff Wade Donovan's visits had grown more frequent since Samuel's passing, his offers of protection more insistent. What had started as seemingly neighborly concern had taken on an edge that made her skin crawl. The way his eyes lingered on her property when he thought she wasn't looking, the casual questions about her finances, the subtle suggestions that a woman alone couldn't possibly manage such a large spread, all pointed toward intentions that had nothing to do with her welfare. "He's patient, I'll give him that," she continued, brushing snow from the marker. "But he doesn't understand that some things aren't for sale or trade. This land, this life we built it, means something beyond what any deed or marriage certificate could say." The sound of approaching hoofbeats broke her meditation, and Cora straightened with a familiar mix of dread and resignation. Through the trees, she could see the sheriff's distinctive black gelding picking its way along the creek path, Donovan's bulky figure hunched against the cold. He rode with the casual arrogance of a man accustomed to having his way, never bothering to announce his visits or wait for invitation. Cora smoothed her skirts and walked back toward the cabin, reaching the porch just as Donovan guided his horse into the yard. At 45, the sheriff was a man who'd grown soft around the middle from too many free meals and too little honest work. His badge caught what little light filtered through the clouds, polished to a shine that seemed to mock the tarnished nature of the authority it represented. "Morning, Mrs. James," he called out, swinging down from his saddle with practiced ease. "Thought I'd check on you before this next storm hits. Weather like this can be dangerous for a woman living alone." "Good morning, Sheriff." Cora kept her voice level, polite but not welcoming. "As you can see, I'm managing just fine." Donovan tied his horse to the porch rail and stomped his boots on the wooden steps, removing more snow than necessary in what Cora recognized as a territorial gesture. "Mind if I come in for a cup of coffee? It's bitter cold out here, and I've got some official business to discuss." Every instinct told Cora to refuse, but she also knew that outright rudeness to the sheriff would only invite more scrutiny. "I suppose I can spare a few minutes." Inside the warm cabin, Donovan removed his hat and coat, settling himself at Samuel's place at the kitchen table, without invitation. Cora poured coffee from the pot she kept warm on the stove, noting how the sheriff's eyes roamed over her home with calculating interest. "Fine place you've got here," he said, accepting the steaming cup. "Samuel did right by you, building something this solid. Course, it's a lot for one person to maintain." "I'm managing." Cora took the chair across from him, keeping the table between them like a barrier. "For now, maybe. But winter's barely started, and you've got months of hard weather ahead. What happens when that roof needs fixing, or the barn door comes off its hinges in a windstorm? What happens when those fence posts start rotting come spring?" Cora sipped her coffee, tasting its bitterness like a promise of the conversation to come. "I'll deal with problems as they arise, same as Samuel and I always did." Donovan leaned back in his chair, his bulk making the furniture creak. "See, that's where you're thinking small, Cora. May I call you Cora?" He didn't wait for permission. "A woman in your position needs to think about security, about the future. You can't just hope things will work out." "What exactly are you suggesting, Sheriff?" "I'm suggesting you need a partner. Someone with authority in this county, someone who can make sure you're protected and provided for." His smile was meant to be charming, but fell short, landing somewhere between presumptuous and predatory. "I'm suggesting you need a husband." The words hung in the air between them like smoke from a badly tended fire. Cora set down her coffee cup with deliberate care, buying herself a moment to choose her response. She'd known this conversation was coming, had felt it building through weeks of increasingly bold visits, but hearing the proposal stated so boldly still sent a shock through her system. "That's very thoughtful of you, Sheriff, but I'm not interested in remarrying. Samuel's been gone such a short time, and I need to—" "Samuel's been dead 3 months," Donovan interrupted, his voice taking on a harder edge. "That's plenty of time for mourning. And frankly, Cora, You don't have the luxury of extended grief. This is practical business. Practical business? The phrase sat wrong in her mouth, tasting of calculation and cold ambition. Look around you. Donovan gestured toward the windows, toward the land beyond. 160 acres of prime grazing land, water rights to Willow Creek, a solid cabin and outbuildings. That's worth a considerable sum to the right buyer. Or it could be the foundation of something even more valuable in the right partnership. Understanding dawned like sunrise after a long night, bringing with it a clarity that made Cora's chest tighten with anger. You're not proposing marriage, Sheriff. You're proposing a business arrangement. What's the difference? Marriage is always partly business, especially out here. You need security and protection. He paused, seeming to realize he'd revealed too much of his true motivation. What do you need, Sheriff? What exactly do you get out of this arrangement? Donovan's mask of benevolent concern slipped another degree. I get the satisfaction of knowing a good woman is properly cared for. And yes, I get a partner who understands the realities of life in Wyoming territory. Cora stood, moving to the window where she could see Samuel's grave through the bare trees. The snow was falling harder now, each flake a small, cold truth landing on the world outside. When she turned back to face Donovan, her decision was as clear as the ice forming on the window pane. Sheriff Donovan, I appreciate your concern for my welfare, but I must decline your offer. I'm not ready to remarry, and when I am, it will be to a man I choose, not one who chooses me for my property. The temperature in the room seemed to drop 10 degrees. Donovan's face hardened, the pretense of genteel courtship falling away like a discarded mask. I don't think you understand your situation, Cora. A woman alone out here faces all kinds of dangers. Accidents happen. Claim disputes arise. Sometimes the law can protect people, and sometimes it can't. Are you threatening me, Sheriff? I'm explaining reality. You need protection, and I'm offering it. The alternative is to manage on your own, and we both know how difficult that can be for someone in your position. Cora felt Samuel's presence as surely as if he were standing beside her, his steady strength flowing through her like warmth from the stove. I've managed for 3 months without your protection, and I'll continue to manage. Now I think it's time for you to leave. Donovan stood slowly, his bulk seeming to fill the small kitchen. You're making a mistake, Cora. I won't ask again. Good, then we understand each other. He retrieved his hat and coat, but paused at the door to deliver his parting words. I hope you're as confident in your decision come spring. Wyoming winters have a way of changing people's perspectives. After he left, Cora stood at the window, watching him ride away, his black horse disappearing into the swirling snow like a dark omen. She touched Samuel's ring again, drawing strength from the simple band that represented everything Wade Donovan would never understand about love, partnership, and the bonds that tied two hearts together. Outside, the wind picked up, rattling the windows and sending snow devils dancing across the yard. But inside the cabin, surrounded by the life she and Samuel had built together, Cora James felt only the quiet strength that came from knowing her own mind and standing firm in her convictions. The storm was coming, but she'd weathered storms before. The storm that had been threatening all morning finally broke 3 days after Sheriff Donovan's visit, arriving with the fury of nature at its most unforgiving. By noon, the wind howled through the valley like a living thing, driving snow sideways across the landscape and turning the familiar world into a white wasteland where landmarks disappeared and directions became meaningless. Cora had spent the morning moving her animals to shelter and securing anything that might blow away, working with the methodical efficiency that 26 years of frontier life had taught her. The chickens huddled deep in their coop, the cow stood patient in the barn, and enough firewood was stacked by the cabin door to last several days. She'd weathered worse storms with Samuel, and she could weather this one alone. She was wrong about being alone. The sound of hoofbeats cutting through the wind's roar made her look up from the bread she was kneading for supper. Through the kitchen window, barely visible through the driving snow, she could see multiple riders approaching, Sheriff Donovan flanked by his two deputies, their forms dark against the white fury of the blizzard. Cora's hands stilled on the dough, as understanding settled in her chest like a cold stone. No lawman worth his badge would venture out in weather like this unless the business was urgent. And the only business Wade Donovan had with her was the kind that couldn't wait for fair skies. The pounding on her door came hard and authoritative, designed to intimidate rather than request. Cora wiped her hands on her apron and opened the door to find Donovan standing on her porch, snow clinging to his coat and hat. His face red from cold and something that might have been embarrassment if she thought him capable of such refined emotion. Sheriff. She didn't invite him in. Mrs. James. His voice was formal now, stripped of the false warmth he'd used during his courtship attempts. I'm here on official business. Behind him, his deputies Tom Bradley and young Jake Mills shuffled their feet and avoided meeting her eyes. Both were local boys who'd known Samuel, who'd shared drinks with him at the general store and borrowed tools when needed. The shame on their faces told Cora everything she needed to know about how they felt regarding their current assignment. What kind of official business brings 3 lawmen out in a blizzard? Donovan pulled a folded paper from his coat pocket, the document crackling in the cold air. This is a court order requiring you to vacate these premises immediately. Cora took the paper with hands that remained steady, despite the shock racing through her system. The legal language was dense and intimidating, but the meaning was clear enough. Failure to comply with unnamed county regulations, failure to maintain proper security for claimed land, failure to demonstrate adequate resources for property management. All of it bureaucratic nonsense that boiled down to one simple truth, Wade. Donovan was using his badge to take what he couldn't win through courtship. This is ridiculous, she said, looking up from the document. Samuel and I have owned this land legally for 26 years. We've paid every tax, met every requirement. Requirements change, Donovan interrupted. New territorial regulations require adequate security and management for homesteads this size. A single woman can't meet those requirements. Since when? Since I say so. The mask was completely off now, revealing the corruption that had been lurking beneath his veneer of respectability. You had your chance to do this the easy way, Cora. You chose the hard way instead. Young Jake Mills stepped forward, his voice barely audible above the wind. Sheriff, maybe we should wait for the storm to pass. The order is effective immediately, Donovan snapped. Weather doesn't change legal requirements. Cora felt the world tilting beneath her feet, the solid foundation of law and justice, revealing itself to be as shifting and treacherous as quicksand. You can't do this. People will. People will what? Donovan's smile was cold as the wind cutting through her coat. Who's going to stop me? Who's going to risk crossing the sheriff over one stubborn widow? The terrible truth of his words hit her like a physical blow. In a frontier town where the law was whatever the man with the badge said it was, who would stand up to Wade Donovan for a woman who'd already proven she couldn't be bought or bullied into compliance? Dr. Henley was too old, Reverend Mills too gentle, and the other townspeople too dependent on the sheriff's goodwill to risk their own security for hers. How long do I have? You have now. Tom Jake start loading her belongings. The next hour passed like a fever dream, reality bending and shifting in ways that seemed impossible even as they happened before her eyes. The deputies moved through her home with apologetic efficiency, carrying out furniture, clothing, kitchen supplies, and all the accumulated possessions of a quarter-century marriage. Everything that had made the cabin a home was reduced to a pile of belongings in the yard, where the falling snow began immediately to claim it. Cora stood on her own porch, watching strangers handle the quilts she'd sewn, the dishes she'd served countless meals on, the rocking chair where Samuel had sat every evening reading his paper. Each item that passed through her door felt like another small death, another piece of her life stripped away by the arbitrary cruelty of corrupted power. "Ma'am, I'm sorry about this," Tom Bradley murmured as he carried out Samuel's trunk. "It ain't right, but you're following orders." Cora's voice held no accusation, only the weary understanding of someone who'd learned that good people could still enable evil when their own security was threatened. When the cabin was empty, Donovan emerged carrying the one thing Cora had hoped they wouldn't find: Samuel's Bible, where she'd hidden the original homestead deed between the pages of Psalms. The leather-bound book looked small in his large hands, but she knew he understood its significance as well as she did. Looking for this? He held up the deed, the paper crackling in the cold air. Amazing what you can find when you conduct a thorough search. Amazing how documents sometimes get lost or damaged in bad weather. Before Cora could protest, he crumpled the deed and tossed it into the snow, where the wind immediately began scattering the pieces like confetti at a celebration she hadn't been invited to. 26 years of legal ownership dissolved into meaningless fragments, lost to the storm with the same casual ease that her life had been upended. "You're stealing my home," she said, the words barely audible above the wind. "I'm enforcing the law," Donovan replied. "What happens to abandoned property afterward isn't my concern." He mounted his horse and gestured to his deputies to do the same. "You can file a complaint with the territorial government if you want. Of course, that'll take months to process, and winter won't wait for bureaucrats." As the three men rode away, disappearing into the white wall of the blizzard, Cora found herself alone in her own yard, surrounded by the wreckage of her life. Snow was already beginning to cover her belongings, nature itself seeming to conspire in erasing the evidence of what had been done to her. She could have retreated to the barn for shelter, could have tried to salvage what she could and wait for the storm to pass. But looking at her cabin, Samuel's cabin, their home now standing empty and foreign with its windows dark and its door standing open to the wind, she understood that staying would only prolong the agony. Donovan would be back with more orders, more legal justifications for his theft. He would make her life a misery until she either submitted to his will or died from the harassment. The old Cora, the woman who'd arrived in Wyoming territory as a young bride full of hope and determination, might have fought. But the woman who stood in the snow that afternoon was 54 years old, recently widowed, and tired in ways that went deeper than bone. Sometimes, she realized, dignity lay not in fighting impossible battles, but in choosing how to lose them. She gathered what she could carry: some clothes, a little food, Samuel's pocket watch, and the family Bible that had somehow been overlooked in the chaos. Everything else would have to stay, becoming part of Wade Donovan's prize or fodder for the storm. She no longer cared which. The walk to the road was the longest 50 yards of her life. Each step took her further from the only real home she'd ever known, from the graves of 3 babies who died in infancy, from Samuel's resting place, from every dream and memory that had sustained her through decades of hard living. When she reached the fence line and turned for one last look, the cabin was already disappearing into the swirling snow, becoming just another grey shadow in a world gone white. Cora pulled her worn quilt closer around her shoulders and began walking toward town. The railroad depot was 5 miles away. If she could reach it, she might be able to catch the evening train to Cheyenne, where she had a distant cousin who might take her in. The storm was worsening with each passing minute, and the temperature was dropping fast. But she had no choice now but to put one foot in front of the other and trust that God hadn't brought her this far, just to let her freeze to death on a Wyoming road. Behind her, barely visible through the snow, Sheriff Donovan's badge caught a brief glint of what little light the storm allowed to penetrate the clouds. It was the last thing she saw of Bitter Creek before the town disappeared entirely, swallowed by the blizzard that had become both her enemy and her liberation. 5 miles west of Bitter Creek, in a sheltered grove of cottonwoods along Willow Creek, Emmett Cole sat hunched over his small campfire, writing in the leather-bound journal he'd kept faithfully for the past 15 years of trail driving. The wind howled through the bare branches above his head, sending occasional snow devils swirling through his camp, but the thick stand of trees provided enough shelter to keep his fire burning and his coffee hot. December 18th, 1888, he wrote in his careful script, wintered at Willow Creek Grove, 5 miles west of Bitter Creek, Wyoming territory. Cattle delivered to Denver market November 15th. Good prices this year, better than 87. Weather turning harsh earlier than usual. May need to consider alternative arrangements if spring comes late. Emmett paused, his pencil hovering over the page as he searched for words to describe the melancholy that had been his constant companion since Martha's death 2 winters ago. The journal had been her idea originally, a way to keep track of business details and weather patterns for future reference. But it had become something more over the years, a repository for thoughts and observations that had no other outlet in his solitary life. At 60 years old, Emmett had spent more nights under the stars than in a proper bed, had driven cattle from Texas to Montana more times than he could count, and had earned a reputation as one of the most reliable trail bosses in the business. Men trusted him with their herds because he never lost a head, he didn't have to, never took unnecessary risks, and always brought his crews home safe. It was a good reputation, built over decades of hard work and careful judgment. But reputations, he'd learned, made poor companions during long winter nights. The camp he'd established in the Cottonwood Grove was more elaborate than most drovers bothered with for a temporary stop. He'd built a proper lean-to shelter, dug a fire pit lined with stones, and even rigged a windbreak using canvas and rope. His 2 pack mules grazed peacefully nearby, their winter coats thick and shaggy against the cold. Everything spoke of a man who planned to stay put for a while, though he couldn't have said exactly why he'd chosen this particular spot to wait out the winter. Maybe it was the way the creek curved through the grove, creating a natural amphitheater that blocked the worst of the wind. Maybe it was the proximity to a town where he could buy supplies without the long ride to larger settlements. Or maybe it was simply that he'd grown tired of moving, tired of the endless cycle of gathering herds, driving them north, and then starting over again come spring. Martha would have understood. She'd always been better at reading his moods than he was himself, able to see past his practical nature to the loneliness that drove him to keep moving. "You're looking for something, Emmett Cole," she'd told him during their 2 brief marriage. "You just haven't figured out what it is yet." He'd found it with her for a few precious years, found the peace that came from having someone to come home to, someone who cared whether he made it back safe from the trails. But consumption had taken her just like it took so many others, slowly and relentlessly, until all his careful planning and steady strength hadn't been enough to save the one thing that mattered most. The sound of commotion from the direction of town broke into his brooding. Even through the storm, he could hear raised voices, the sound of horses moving fast, and something that might have been shouting. Emmett looked up from his journal, his weathered face creasing with concern. In his experience, people only made that much noise in bad weather when something was seriously wrong. He capped his pencil and tucked the journal inside his coat, then stood and walked to the edge of his camp where he could get a better view of the road. The snow was falling so hard that visibility was limited to maybe 50 yards, but he could see enough to know that whatever was happening in Bitter Creek wasn't his business. He'd learned long ago that trail bosses who stuck their noses into local disputes usually ended up regretting it. But the voices continued, growing more distant as whatever was happening moved away from town. Emmett found himself straining to listen, his instincts telling him that something wasn't right about the whole situation. After 20 minutes, the commotion faded entirely, leaving only the wind and the steady hiss of snow falling on his fire. He was just settling back down with his coffee when movement on the road caught his eye. A solitary figure was walking toward him through the storm, moving slowly but steadily in the direction of the railroad depot. Even at a distance, Emmett could tell that whoever it was carried themselves with purpose despite the difficult conditions. As the figure drew closer, he could see it was a woman middle-aged, wrapped in what looked like a quilt, carrying a small bundle of possessions. She walked with the measured pace of someone conserving energy for a long journey, her head down against the wind, but her posture straight, despite whatever hardships had put her on the road in weather like this. Emmett's first instinct was to mind his own business. Trail bosses learned early that getting involved with strangers' problems was a good way to find trouble. But something about the woman's solitary struggle against the storm stirred memories of Martha, of the dignity she'd maintained, even as illness ravaged her body. No one should have to face this kind of weather alone, especially not a woman carrying everything she owned in a bundle barely larger than a pillowcase. He made his decision quickly, before Prudence could change his mind. Gathering his coat and hat, he walked out to the road and waited for the woman to reach him. As she approached, he could see that she was older than he'd first thought, probably in her 50s, with graying hair visible beneath a worn bonnet and lines around her eyes that spoke of recent grief. Her face was red from cold and exertion, but she held herself with a quiet dignity that commanded respect. "Ma'am," he called out when she was close enough to hear him over the wind, "looks like you could use some shelter from this storm." The woman stopped and looked at him with eyes that were cautious but not afraid. "That's kind of you, but I'm heading for the depot. Train should be through this evening." "No trains running in weather like this," Emmett replied gently. "And even if it were, you'd freeze solid before you made it another mile. My camp's just through those trees. Fire's warm, coffee's hot, and you're welcome to both." For a moment, she hesitated, and Emmett could see her weighing the risks of accepting help from a stranger against the certainty of dying on the road if she didn't. The wind chose that moment to gust particularly hard, driving snow into their faces and making the decision for her. "I'm grateful," she said simply. Emmett led her through the grove to his camp, noting how she moved with the careful economy of someone who'd learned not to waste energy on unnecessary motion. At the fire, he helped her settle onto a log he'd arranged as a seat and poured coffee from the pot that stayed warm at the edge of the flames. "I'm Emmett Cole," he said, handing her the steaming cup. "Cora James." She wrapped her cold hands around the warm metal, and he saw her shoulders relax slightly as the heat began to penetrate her chilled body. They sat in comfortable silence for a few minutes, listening to the wind and the snap of burning wood. Emmett had learned long ago that people told their stories when they were ready, not when others were curious. But he couldn't help noticing the way Cora's eyes remained alert, despite her exhaustion, the way she kept one hand on the bundle of possessions beside her, as if expecting someone to try to take them away. "You wouldn't happen to know anything about the commotion in town earlier?" he asked finally. Cora's laugh was bitter as the coffee. "I was the commotion. Sheriff decided my homestead would look better with his name on the deed instead of mine." Emmett felt anger stir in his chestnut, the hot, impulsive kind that got men into fights, but the cold, steady anger that came from witnessing injustice. Legal sheriff, or the kind that makes his own laws? The kind that makes his own laws when it suits him, though I suppose most folks would say any sheriff is legal as long as he wears the badge. And you're walking to the depot in a blizzard because staying would mean marrying him, and some things are worse than freezing to death on a Wyoming road. Emmett nodded slowly, understanding more than she'd said. He'd seen men like this sheriff before, petty tyrants who used their authority to take what they wanted and justified it afterward with legal-sounding excuses. Usually they got away with it because people were too scared or too dependent on their goodwill to fight back. "Family waiting for you wherever that train's headed?" "A cousin in Cheyenne. Haven't seen her in 10 years. But she's the only relative I've got left." Cora's voice carried the weight of someone who'd just lost everything familiar and was trying to convince herself that starting over at 54 was possible. Long way to travel in winter. Long way to travel any time when you're doing it alone. The simple honesty of her admission touched something in Emmett that he'd thought had died with Martha. Here was a woman who understood the weight of solitude, who'd been forced to carry burdens that should have been shared. The practical part of his mind warned him to offer a meal and a warm place to wait out the storm, then send her on her way come morning. But the part that remembered what it felt like to have a partner, to be part of something larger than himself, was already considering other possibilities. "Storm's likely to last through the night," he said carefully. "Maybe longer. You're welcome to stay until it breaks." Cora studied his face in the firelight, clearly trying to read his intentions. "You're very kind, Mr. Cole." But I should warn you, kindness to me lately has a way of causing trouble for the person doing the giving. I've been dealing with trouble most of my life, Mrs. James. I expect I can handle a little more." The storm raged through the night, with the fury of nature unleashed, turning the world beyond Emmett's camp into a howling white void. But within the shelter of the cottonwood grove, beside the steady warmth of the fire, Cora James found herself experiencing something she hadn't felt since Samuel's death, the simple comfort of not being alone. Emmett had rigged a privacy screen using canvas and rope, creating a small sheltered area where she could sleep without impropriety. He'd given her his best blankets and taken the thin ones for himself, despite her protests. When she'd tried to refuse his kindness, he'd simply said, "Martha would have my hide if I let a lady freeze while I stayed warm." And something in his voice told her that Martha had been someone worth honoring. As dawn broke grey and cold over the snow-covered landscape, Cora emerged from her makeshift shelter to find Emmett already up, tending the fire and preparing what smelled like real eggs and bacon instead of the hardtack and jerky she'd expected from a trail camp. "Morning," he said without looking up from the skillet. "Storm's past, but the snow's knee-deep and still coming down light. Coffee's ready if you want some." Cora accepted the steaming cup gratefully, noting how he moved around the camp with the easy efficiency of a man accustomed to taking care of himself in the wilderness. Everything had its place, every action served a purpose, yet there was nothing hurried or anxious about his movements. It was the kind of competence that came from years of practice and a temperament that didn't waste energy on worry. "You keep chickens out here?" she asked, gesturing toward the eggs. "Trading post in town. I stop by every few days for supplies." He glanced up at her with a slight smile. "Even old trail bosses get tired of beans and hardtack after a while." They ate in comfortable silence, the only sounds the crackling of the fire and the whisper of falling snow. Cora found herself studying her unexpected benefactor in the morning light. Emmett Cole was a man who'd clearly spent his life. Outdoors, his face was weathered by sun and wind, his hands scarred from years of handling rope and livestock. But there was a gentleness in his eyes that spoke of someone who understood suffering and chose kindness despite it. "Tell me about Martha," she said suddenly, surprising herself with the boldness of the question. Emmett's hands stilled on his coffee cup, and for a moment Cora thought she'd overstepped. But then he smiled, an expression that transformed his weathered features and gave her a glimpse of the younger man he'd once been. Martha was. He paused, searching for words. She was the kind of woman who could make a one-room cabin feel like a palace just by being in it. Met her in Abilene when I was bringing a herd through. She was teaching school there, boarding with the preacher and his wife. He reached into his coat pocket and withdrew a small object wrapped in soft cloth. Unwrapping it carefully, he revealed a delicate cameo brooch, the ivory face of a woman carved with exquisite detail against a background of pale blue stone. This was hers, only piece of jewelry she ever owned, but she treasured it because it had belonged to her mother. Emmett's thumb traced the edge of the brooch with infinite care. She wore it every Sunday to church, said it made her feel connected to family she'd lost. Cora felt her throat tighten with recognition. "How long were you married?" 3 years. Not near long enough, but I'm grateful for every day we had." He rewrapped the brooch and tucked it away. She understood the trail life, understood why I couldn't settle down in one place. Said she'd rather have part of me than all of somebody else. What happened to her? Consumption. Started as a cough that wouldn't go away, got worse over the course of a year. By the end, his voice caught slightly. By the end, she weighed less than a child, but she never complained, never asked why it had to be her. They sat quietly for a moment, united by the shared understanding of loss that came to those who'd loved deeply and been forced to let go. Finally, Cora spoke. "Samuel and I had 26 years together. Not a day goes by that I don't thank God for them, but also not a day goes by that I don't wish we'd had 26 more." "What was he like?" Cora smiled, feeling the familiar warmth that always came when she spoke of her husband. "Steady. That's the word I always come back to. Samuel was steady like bedrock, like sunrise, like the seasons changing. You could set your life by his reliability. She twisted the wedding ring on her finger, the gesture automatic after months of repetition. He was the kind of man who'd notice if I seemed tired and suggest I sit while he finished the dishes, who'd bring me wildflowers he picked on his way back from checking the cattle, who'd read to me in the evenings, even after 14 hours of hard work because he knew I loved the sound of his voice. Sounds like you had something special. We did, which is why Sheriff Donovan's proposal was so insulting. He looked at our life together and saw nothing but property to be acquired. Saw me as an inconvenient obstacle to what he really wanted. Emmett's jaw tightened. Some men never learn the difference between taking and earning. As the morning progressed, they found themselves sharing more of their stories. Emmett told her about the trails he'd driven, the country he'd seen from Texas to Montana, the satisfaction of bringing a herd through safely despite weather, rustlers, and all the other hazards that could befall a cattle drive. Cora spoke of the homestead she and Samuel had built, the children they'd lost in infancy, the dreams they'd shared for the land, and the life they were creating together. There was something healing in the exchange, each story a small gift offered and received. Cora realized that she hadn't really talked to Anya, just exchanged pleasantries or discussed practical matters, but actually talked since Samuel's death. The loneliness she'd been carrying like a stone in her chest began to feel lighter, not gone but shared in a way that made it bearable. "What will you do now?" Emmett asked as the afternoon light began to fade. "In Cheyenne, I mean." Cora had been dreading this question, but facing it directly felt better than the anxious uncertainty that had been gnawing at her. "I don't know. My cousin Emma has a boarding house. Maybe she'll let me work for room and board until I can figure out something else. I can cook, clean, sew there. Must be something a woman my age can do to earn her keep. And after that? After that is a luxury I can't afford to think about yet. Right now I'm focused on getting through today, then tomorrow, then the day after that." Emmett nodded, understanding the wisdom of taking life one challenge at a time. But Cora could see something working behind his eyes, some thought or possibility that he was turning over in his mind, like a man examining a piece of interesting rock. "Can I ask you something that might sound forward?" Cora felt her pulse quicken, but she nodded. "What if you didn't have to go to Cheyenne? What if there was another option?" "What kind of option?" Emmett was quiet for a long moment, staring into the fire, as if the flames might provide the words he needed. When he finally spoke, his voice was careful and measured. "I've been thinking about settling down, finding a place to call home instead of spending every winter alone, waiting for spring to come so I can start moving again. Been thinking about it even more since Martha died, about what it means to have a life instead of just an existence." Cora felt something flutter in her chest part, hope, part fear, part recognition of a possibility she hadn't dared consider. And maybe we could help each other. Maybe two people who understand loss and loneliness could find a way to build something together, even if it's not the same as what we had before. The suggestion hung in the air between them, like a bridge that could be crossed or burned, depending on her response. Cora found herself thinking not just about the practical advantages of such an arrangement: security, companionship, a future that didn't depend on the charity of distant relatives, but about the unexpected comfort she'd found in Emmett's presence, the way he listened without judgment and spoke without pretense. "What exactly are you suggesting, Mr. Cole?" "I'm suggesting that maybe we don't have to face whatever comes next alone. I'm suggesting that maybe sometimes the best partnerships are the ones built on mutual respect and shared understanding, rather than passion and promises that might not survive the first real test." It was the most honest proposal Cora had ever heard, free of the romantic fantasies that young people entertained and the calculated greed that had motivated Sheriff Donovan. Emmett was offering partnership, not possession, companionship rather than conquest. "I need to think about it," she said finally. "Of course you do. And whatever you decide, I'll respect. But Cora misses." James, I want you to know that if you're willing to take a chance on an old trail boss who's finally ready to come in from the range, I promise you'll never have to wonder where your next meal is coming from or whether you'll have a roof over your head come winter. As evening fell and they prepared for their second night in the camp, Cora found herself watching Emmett with new eyes. She was 54 years old, recently widowed, with nothing to her name but the clothes on her back and the strength in her hands. He was 60, a man who'd spent his life moving from place to place, carrying his loneliness like a familiar burden. Maybe, she thought as she settled into her makeshift shelter, sometimes the best things in life came not from grand romance or passionate love, but from two people choosing to face the world together instead of apart. Maybe sometimes healing came not from forgetting the past, but from finding someone who understood its weight and was willing to help carry it forward into whatever future awaited. Dawn of the third day brought crystalline air so cold it hurt to breathe, and a sky so clear it seemed to ring like a bell. The storm had passed completely, leaving behind a transformed landscape where every branch, every fence post, every blade of grass was outlined in pristine white. It was beautiful and terrible and urgent all at once, because both Cora and Emmett understood that perfect weather like this wouldn't last long in the Wyoming territory in January. Cora emerged from her shelter to find Emmett already breaking down parts of the camp, his movements efficient but not hurried. He'd laid out what looked like traveling provisions on a piece of canvas-dried meat, hardtack, coffee, and a small pot for boiling water. "Time to make some decisions," he said without preamble. "Weather's clear enough to travel, but it won't stay that way long. If you're set on catching that train to Cheyenne, today's the day to make the attempt." Cora wrapped her shawl tighter around her shoulders and accepted the cup of coffee he offered. The hot liquid sent warmth spreading through her chest, but it couldn't touch the cold knot of uncertainty that had been growing there since his proposal the evening before. "And if I'm not set on Cheyenne? Then we need to talk about practical matters, about what partnership between us would actually look like, not just the pretty words about companionship and shared burdens." She appreciated his directness. Samuel had been the same way, willing to discuss difficult subjects head-on, rather than dancing around them with polite evasions. "What kind of practical matters?" Emmett settled beside her, on the log that had become their informal conference table. "First thing is where we'd live. I've got money saved from 15 years of trail driving, enough to buy a small spread or put a down payment on something larger. But I don't know this country well enough to choose wisely, and I don't have the connections to find the right place." "You're thinking of staying in Wyoming territory." "I'm thinking of staying wherever you are, if you'll have me. You know this area, know the people, know what to watch out for. That's valuable knowledge." Cora felt a flutter of something that might have been hope. The idea of rebuilding somewhere familiar, somewhere she understood the rhythms of weather and community, held more appeal than starting completely over among strangers in Cheyenne. "There are places," she said carefully, "small homesteads that come up for sale when people give up and head back east. Good land usually, just not enough capital or commitment behind it to make it work." "What would we need? To make it work, I mean?" It was a question she and Samuel had discussed countless times during their years together, usually on winter evenings, when the isolation forced them to examine their choices and plan for the future. Cattle, definitely. Maybe 40 or 50 head to start, enough to generate income, but not so many that we couldn't handle them ourselves. Good horses for working stock. Equipment for farming, enough to feed ourselves and put up hay for winter. What about help? Hired hands. Not right away. 2 people who know what they're doing can manage a small operation, especially if they're not trying to get rich quick. She paused, realizing how easily she'd slipped into talking about they and we, as if the decision had already been made. "Samuel and I ran our place with just occasional help during roundup and branding." Emmett nodded thoughtfully. "I've got experience with cattle, but not much with farming. Would need to learn. I could teach you what Samuel taught me. Basic things: when to plant, how to read the soil, which crops grow best in this climate. It's not complicated if you're willing to learn. And the social side, How would people in Bitter Creek react to us showing up married? The question cut to the heart of her deepest concerns. Some would be scandalized by the speed of it. Others would understand that survival sometimes requires practical choices. But Sheriff Donovan... She stopped, her hand unconsciously moving to Samuel's pocket watch in her coat. The steady tick had become a comfort, a reminder that time moved forward, whether she was ready or not. What about Donovan? He won't give up easily. If I marry you, if we try to settle nearby, he'll see it as a direct challenge to his authority. He's not the kind of man who tolerates being defied. Emmett was quiet for a long moment, his weathered hands wrapped around his coffee cup. Cora, I need you to understand something about me. I've been dealing with men like Donovan, my whole working life trail bosses, who thought their authority gave them the right to abuse their crews, cattlemen who tried to cheat drovers out of fair payment, town sheriffs who expected bribes to let herds pass through peacefully. He looked up at her, and she saw something in his eyes that reminded her of Samuel, not anger, but the quiet determination of a man who'd learned when to bend and when to stand firm. I don't go looking for fights, but I don't back down from them either when they come to me. If Donovan wants to make trouble for us, he'll find out that stealing from a lone widow is different from tangling with a couple who know their rights and have the resources to defend them. The confidence in his voice was reassuring, but Cora had lived in Bitter Creek long enough to know that Wade Donovan fought dirty when cornered. He has the law on his side. He has a badge. That's not the same thing as having the law on his side. There's territorial authority above him, federal marshals if it comes to that. Corrupt sheriffs eventually overreach themselves, and when they do, the structure above them tends to come down hard. You sound like you've seen it happen before. More than once. Power that's taken instead of earned doesn't last. Problem is, it can do a lot of damage while it exists. They sat in comfortable silence, each lost in their own thoughts. Around them, the winter landscape sparkled with deceptive beauty, every surface touched with frost that would melt as soon as the sun climbed higher. It was a reminder of how quickly conditions could change, how important it was to make decisions while the opportunity still existed. "Can I tell you what scares me most about your offer?" Cora asked finally. "Please do." "It's not Donovan, or the practical challenges, or what people might say about us marrying so quickly." She twisted Samuel's ring on her finger, the gesture automatic and comforting. "It's that I liked being married. I was good at it. Samuel and I were partners in the truest sense way, made decisions together, supported each other's dreams, shared the work and the worry and the joy of building something meaningful. That sounds like exactly what I'm hoping for. But what if I can't do it again? What if the partnership I had with Samuel was specific to him, and I'm not capable of creating that kind of connection with someone else?" Her voice caught slightly. "What if I disappoint you, or you disappoint me, and we end up trapped in something that makes us both miserable?" Emmett set down his coffee and turned to face her fully. "Cora, I'm not asking you to recreate what you had with Samuel. I'm not asking you to love me the way you loved him, or to pretend that what we might build together would be the same as what you lost." He paused, seeming to choose his words carefully. "I'm asking if you're willing to try something different, something that starts with friendship and respect and mutual need, and see where it goes from there. Maybe it becomes something deeper over time, maybe it doesn't. But either way, we face whatever comes together instead of alone. And if it doesn't become something deeper, if we remain just partners in the business sense, then we remain partners in the business sense, and that's still better than what either of us has now." His smile was gentle but determined. "I'd rather spend my remaining years in honest partnership with a woman I respect than in loneliness, hoping for something that might never come." Cora felt something shift inside her chest, like ice beginning to crack under the pressure of spring runoff. It wasn't love or not yet, maybe not ever in the way she'd loved Samuel. But it was possibility, and after 3 months of feeling like her life was ending rather than continuing, possibility felt like a precious gift. "What would we do about—" She hesitated, unsure how to phrase the delicate question. About the physical side of marriage, Emmett's directness was both embarrassing and relieving. "We'd take that as slowly as everything else. I'm not looking for a wife to satisfy my needs, Cora. I'm looking for a partner to share my life. If intimacy develops naturally over time, we'll deal with it like adults. If it doesn't, we'll still be better off than we are now. It was perhaps the most honest conversation about marriage she'd ever heard, free of romantic delusions and practical deceptions alike. Samuel had courted her with flowers and poetry, and she'd loved every minute of it. But she was no longer a 28-year-old bride with dreams of romance. She was a 54-year-old widow with practical needs and a realistic understanding of what life could and couldn't provide. How quickly would we need to decide? Today, if we're going to do it, the weather won't hold, and if we're going to confront Donovan, it needs to be soon. Every day we wait gives him more time to consolidate his theft of your property. My property that no longer legally exists, you mean? Your property that he stole using forged documents and trumped-up charges. Just because he destroyed the original deed doesn't mean the Territorial Land Office doesn't have records. Fraud is fraud, regardless of what badge the person committing it happens to wear. The practical implications of his plan were beginning to sink in. You're talking about more than just marriage. You're talking about fighting back. I'm talking about standing up. There's a difference. Emmett's expression grew serious. But yes, if we do this, we're not just solving your immediate problems. We're making a statement that Wade Donovan doesn't get to terrorize people without consequences. Cora looked out across the snow-covered landscape toward the distant smoke of Bitter Creek, rising into the clear winter air. Somewhere in that town was the homestead she and Samuel had built together, now sitting empty while its rightful owner shivered beside a campfire in the wilderness. Somewhere in that town was a corrupt sheriff who thought he could take whatever he wanted simply because he had the power to do so. And somewhere in that town were people Dr. Henley, Mrs. Patterson, Reverend Mills, and others who knew right from wrong, but felt helpless to act against authority, no matter how corrupt that authority might be. If we do this, she said slowly, if we marry and go back to confront Donovan, what exactly are we hoping to accomplish? We're hoping to reclaim what's rightfully yours, expose his corruption, and build a life together that's based on something more solid than fear and theft. Emmett reached over and gently covered her hand with his. And we're hoping to show other people that sometimes the right choice is also the possible choice, even when it doesn't seem that way at first. Cora felt the warmth of his touch through her cold skin, and with it came a certainty that surprised her with its strength. This wasn't the passionate love she'd shared with Samuel, but it was something real and valuable in its own right, the offer of partnership from a good man who understood the weight of loss and the courage required to begin again. "All right," she said, her voice steady despite the magnitude of the decision. "Let's do it." The walk back toward Bitter Creek took them through country that looked entirely different under its blanket of fresh snow. Familiar landmarks had been transformed into strange, beautiful sculptures of white, and the silence was so complete that their footsteps seemed to echo across the empty landscape. Emmett led one of his pack mules loaded with their essential supplies, while Cora carried the worn quilt that had become both her shield against the cold and her symbol of resourcefulness in the face of loss. As they walked, they talked with the careful deliberation of two people getting to know their new partner. The conversation was different from the tentative sharing of the previous days, more practical, more immediate, colored by the understanding that they were no longer strangers, considering possibilities, but partners planning a future together. "Tell me about Reverend Mills," Emmett said, as they paused to rest at the top of a small rise. Below them, Bitter Creek spread out like a child's toy village, smoke rising from chimneys and the yellow glow of lamplight visible in windows despite the early hour. "He's a good man, but not a strong one," Cora replied, adjusting the quilt around her shoulders. "Been the preacher here for about 8 years. Came west after his wife died back in Pennsylvania, said he needed to go somewhere. His grief wouldn't follow him everywhere he looked. Did it work? I think it helped. He throws himself into taking care of other people's spiritual needs as a way of managing his own loss. He's married 3 times as many couples as he's buried, baptized dozens of babies, and never missed a Sunday service, even during the worst weather. But Cora sighed, her breath creating a small cloud in the frigid air. But he's afraid of conflict, sees his role as bringing peace rather than fighting injustice. When Donovan started pressuring people, started bending the law to suit his own purposes, Reverend Mills just prayed harder instead of speaking up. Will he marry us? Yes, if we can convince him it's what we both want, rather than something you're doing out of pity or I'm doing out of desperation. She looked at Emmett sideways. Is that what we're doing? I don't know what you're doing, but I'm marrying a woman I respect because I think we can build something good together. Is that desperation? Cora considered the question as they resumed walking. Maybe, but if it is, it's the kind of desperation that leads to wise choices rather than foolish ones. They talked about the other people they would encounter. Dr. Henley, who had been Samuel's friend and would either support them or judge them depending on how they presented their case. Mrs. Patterson, who ran the general store and knew everyone's business but could be trusted to keep confidences when asked. Tom Bradley and Jake Mills, the young deputies who might be willing to stand up to their boss if given sufficient reason and support. The key, Cora explained, is understanding that most people in Bitter Creek aren't evil, they're just scared. Donovan has made it clear that crossing him has consequences, and folks with families and businesses can't afford to take the kind of risks that someone with nothing left to lose might take. So we need to show them that not taking risks also has consequences. Emmett replied, that letting corruption go unchallenged eventually threatens everyone's security, not just the immediate victims. As they approached the outskirts of town, Cora felt her stomach tighten with nervous energy. The last time she'd walked this road, she'd been fleeing in disgrace, cast out into a blizzard with nothing but the clothes on her back and the small bundle of possessions she'd managed to salvage. Now she was returning as half of a partnership, with a plan and an ally, and at least some hope of reclaiming what had been stolen from her. Second thoughts? Emmett asked, noticing her hesitation. Dozens of them, but not about you, about us, about whether we're being naive to think we can make this work. Probably we are being naive about some things. Most people are when they're starting something new. Question is whether we're smart enough to adapt when we figure out what we got wrong. They decided to approach Reverend Mills first, before word of their return could reach Sheriff Donovan. The small white church sat at the end of Main Street, its bell tower pointing toward heaven like a finger raised in either prayer or accusation. Behind it stood the modest parsonage where the Reverend lived alone with his books and his memories. They found him in his study, hunched over his desk working on what appeared to be Sunday's sermon. He looked up as they knocked, his thin face brightening with surprise and concern when he saw Cora. Mrs. James, thank God you're safe. When I heard about what happened, he stopped, noticing Emmett standing beside her. I'm sorry, I don't believe we've met. Emmett Cole, Emmett said, extending his hand. I'm a friend of Mrs. James. Reverend Mills. The preacher shook hands, but his eyes remained troubled. Please, come in out of the cold. I'll put coffee on. As they settled in the Reverend's small sitting room, Cora could see him trying to piece together their story. Mills was a perceptive man despite his tendency toward conflict avoidance, and he clearly understood that something significant had changed since Cora's exile 3 days earlier. Reverend, Cora began, Mr. Cole and I have a request to make of you. What kind of request? We'd like you to marry us, today if possible. The coffee cup froze halfway to Reverend Mills' lips. I beg your pardon. You heard correctly. Mr. Cole has asked me to marry him, and I've accepted. But Mrs. James, you've known each other for what, 3 days, and Samuel has been gone such a short time. 3 months, Cora interrupted gently. Samuel has been gone 3 months, and I've been alone for every day of it, until Mr. Cole found me on the road during the blizzard. Emmett leaned forward slightly. Reverend, I understand this seems sudden. Under normal circumstances, Cora and I would take time for a proper courtship, would give the community time to get used to the idea of us together. But circumstances aren't normal. What exactly are you saying? I'm saying that Sheriff Donovan has made it clear he intends to claim Cora's property one way or another. If she remains unmarried and alone, she's vulnerable to his continued harassment. If she's married to someone with the resources and determination to protect her interests, the situation changes. Reverend Mills set down his coffee cup with shaking hands. You're talking about Sheriff Donovan, as if he's some kind of criminal. What would you call a man who uses forged legal documents to steal a widow's homestead? Cora asked quietly. I would call it— Mills stopped, the words seeming to stick in his throat. I would call it a matter for the territorial authorities to investigate. And while they investigate, which could take months, what happens to me? Where do I live? How do I eat? How do I protect myself from a man who's already proven he's willing to abuse his authority to get what he wants? The Reverend was quiet for a long moment, clearly struggling with the conflict between his desire to avoid confrontation and his recognition that injustice had indeed been done. Finally, he spoke. Even if I agreed to perform the ceremony, marriage for the wrong reasons, marriage without love is still a sin in the eyes of God. Who says it's without love? Emmett's voice was gentle but firm. Reverend, I've been alone for 2 years since my wife Martha died. In 3 days, Cora has reminded me what it feels like to have a partner, someone to share the burdens and joys of daily life. Maybe that's not the passionate love of young people, but it's something real and valuable. And I, Cora added, have discovered that caring can grow between 2 people even in the shortest time when they recognize something familiar in each other's loss and hope. Reverend Mills looked back and forth between them, his scholarly face creased with uncertainty. This is highly irregular. The church expects a proper engagement period, posting of bans, time for the community to offer counsel. The church also expects its ministers to protect the vulnerable from those who would exploit them, Emmett replied. Sometimes following the spirit of the law requires bending the letter of it. After what felt like an eternity, Reverend Mills sighed deeply. If I do this, and I'm not saying I will, but if I do this, I need to hear from both of you that this is truly what you want, not just what circumstances seem to require. Cora reached over and took Emmett's hand, feeling the calloused strength of fingers that had spent decades working with rope and leather and livestock. Reverend, I can't promise you that what Emmett and I are building together will look like what Samuel and I had. But I can promise you that it's real, that it's chosen freely by both of us, and that it offers both of us a chance at happiness we wouldn't have alone. And I, Emmett said, his thumb gently stroking across Cora's knuckles, can promise you that I will honor and protect and provide for Cora, not because duty requires it, but because she deserves nothing less. Maybe love will grow between us over time, maybe it won't, but respect and partnership are already there. Reverend Mills studied their joined hands for a long moment, and Cora could see the exact moment when his pastoral instincts overcame his bureaucratic concerns. All right, he said finally. All right, if this is truly what you both want, if you understand the seriousness of the commitment you're making, then I'll perform the ceremony. But I'll need witnesses, at least 2 people who can testify that the marriage was entered into freely by both parties. Dr. Henley, Cora suggested immediately, and Mrs. Patterson, if she's willing. That should be sufficient. When did you want to do this? Emmett and Cora exchanged glances. As soon as possible, she said, before Sheriff Donovan learns I'm back in town and tries to interfere. This afternoon, then. I'll send word to Dr. Henley and Mrs. Patterson, ask them to meet us here at 3 o'clock. Reverend Mills stood, suddenly energized by having a specific task to focus on. You'll need a marriage license from the territorial office, but I can handle that paperwork afterward and backdate it if necessary. As they prepared to leave, Cora felt a mixture of excitement and terror, unlike anything she'd experienced since her wedding day 26 years earlier. She was about to marry a man she'd known for 3 days, in defiance of social convention and in direct challenge to a corrupt sheriff who had already proven his willingness to abuse his power. It was either the most foolish thing she'd ever done or the wisest. Only time would tell which. 3 o'clock in the afternoon found Cora standing in Reverend Mill's small church, wearing the same dress she'd fled town in 3 days earlier, but feeling like an entirely different woman. Emmett stood beside her in his cleanest shirt and coat, his weathered hands steady as he held the marriage certificate blank that would, within the hour, transform them from strangers into husband and wife. Dr. Henley had arrived first, his greying beard newly trimmed and his medical bag set aside in favor of his Sunday best. At 72, he was one of the few people in Bitter Creek who remembered the territory before men like Wade Donovan had learned to exploit its growing pains. His presence felt like a blessing from the past, a connection to the honest values that had originally drawn settlers to this harsh but promising land. Mrs. Patterson had come despite her obvious nervousness, clutching her husband's worn Bible and casting frequent glances toward the church windows as if expecting Sheriff Donovan to appear at any moment. At 45, she'd run the general store with quiet efficiency for 15 years, learning everyone's business while keeping their secrets. Her willingness to serve as witness spoke to both her courage and her recognition that some lines, once crossed, couldn't be uncrossed. "Are we ready?" Reverend Mills asked, his voice carrying only the slightest tremor of anxiety. Cora looked at Emmett, seeing in his steady blue eyes the same mixture of determination and uncertainty she felt in her own chest. They were about to bind their lives together based on 3 days of acquaintance and a shared understanding that loneliness was a heavier burden than compromise. It should have felt reckless, but instead it felt like the most sensible thing she'd done since Samuel's death. "We're ready," she said. The ceremony was simple, stripped of the elaborate ritual that had marked her first wedding. No flowers, no music, no gathering of family and friends to witness the beginning of their life together. Just two middle-aged people standing before God and a handful of witnesses, promising to honor and protect and care for each other through whatever trials lay ahead. When Reverend Mills asked if she took Emmett Cole to be her lawfully wedded husband, Cora felt Samuel's ring slide easily from her fingerknot, removed in rejection of their shared past, but repositioned as a symbol of love that would always be part of who she was, worn now on her right hand, where it could honor memory without competing with possibility. "I do," she said, her voice clear and strong. When Emmett promised to love and honor and cherish her in sickness and in health, for richer or poorer, until death parted them. Cora heard in his words not the passionate declarations of young love, but something perhaps more valuably, measured commitment of a man who understood what marriage meant and was choosing it with full knowledge of its demands. "I do," he said, and slipped a simple gold band onto her finger. She realized later that he must have purchased it that morning while she waited at the church, must have somehow found time to visit the jeweler and select something appropriate for a bride he'd known less than a week. "By the power vested in me by the territory of Wyoming," Reverend Mills intoned, "I now pronounce you husband and wife. Mr. Cole, you may kiss your bride." The kiss was gentle, respectful, and brief a sealing of their agreement, rather than a declaration of passion. But Cora felt something shift inside her as their lips met, a recognition that this man was now her partner in more than just name, that they had just taken a step that would change both their lives irrevocably. "Congratulations, Mrs. Cole," Dr. Henley said warmly, embracing her with the affection of an old family friend. "Samuel would be proud of your courage." "I hope so," Cora replied, testing the sound of her new name in her mind. Mrs. Cole. After 26 years of being Mrs. James, it would take some getting used to. Mrs. Patterson pressed the worn Bible into her hands. "This was my mother's. I'd like you to have it. For luck and because I think you're going to need God's protection in the days ahead." As they signed the marriage certificate, making their union official in the eyes of the law, Cora felt the weight of what they'd just accomplished. The document in her hands was more than just a piece of paper. It was a weapon, a shield, and a declaration of independence all rolled into one. Wade Donovan could no longer treat her as a helpless widow, ripe for exploitation. She was now Emmett Cole's wife, with all the legal protections and social status that marriage provided. But even as she savored the moment of triumph, she knew their real challenges were just beginning. Donovan wouldn't simply accept her marriage and fade gracefully into the background. Men like him didn't surrender power without a fight, especially when that power had been challenged in such a public and definitive way. "What now?" she asked Emmett as they prepared to leave the church. "Now we go claim your homestead. Our homestead." The walk to the house she'd shared with Samuel felt like a journey through time, each familiar landmark carrying memories of the life she'd built and lost, and was now, somehow, reclaiming in a different form. The snow-covered fields where she and Samuel had planned their crops, the creek where they'd drawn water for 26 years, the cemetery where he lay, buried beneath a simple wooden marker, all of it was still there, still part of the landscape of her life, but viewed now through the lens of partnership rather than solitude. The cabin itself stood exactly as she'd left it, 3 days earlier. Door ajar, windows dark, the accumulated possessions of a lifetime scattered in the yard where snow had begun to claim them. But somehow it looked different to her now, not like the scene of a defeat, but like a challenge waiting to be met. "It's smaller than I expected," Emmett said as they approached the porch. "But solid. Samuel built it to last." Cora tested the door, finding it swollen from the moisture but still functional. "Everything inside will need to be cleaned and reorganized, but the structure is sound." They spent the next hour surveying the damage, gathering up possessions that could be salvaged, and assessing what would need to be replaced. The work was both heartbreaking and healing, each familiar object, a connection to the past, but also a building block for the future. Emmett moved through the space with the careful attention of a man learning the layout of his new home, asking questions about Sam's farming methods and Cora's daily routines. "We'll need supplies," he said as they finished their inventory. "Food, firewood, lamp oil, enough to last through the rest of winter." "The general store?" "We'll know within an hour that we're here and married, which means Donovan will know within 2 hours." Emmett's expression was thoughtful but not worried. "Question is whether he'll come here tonight or wait until morning." As if summoned by their conversation, the sound of approaching horses cut through the evening air. Through the kitchen window, Cora could see 3 riders approaching along the creek path, Sheriff Donovan flanked by his usual deputies, their forms dark against the snow-covered landscape. "That answers that question," she murmured. Emmett moved to stand beside her at the window, his hand resting lightly on her shoulder. "Remember, we're not the same people he dealt with 3 days ago. We're married, we're legal, and we have rights he can't simply ignore. Tell him that." The pounding on the door was aggressive and demanding, designed to intimidate rather than request entry. But when Emmett opened it, he did so with the calm confidence of a man who owned the place and had every right to be there. "Sheriff," he said pleasantly, "something we can help you with?" Donovan's face was flushed with anger and something that might have been embarrassment. Behind him, his deputies looked uncomfortable, as if they understood they were about to witness something that wouldn't reflect well on any of them. "I'm here to arrest Mrs. James for trespassing on county property," Donovan said, his voice tight with barely controlled rage. "I'm afraid you'll have some difficulty with that, Sheriff, since there's no Mrs. James here." Emmett stepped aside slightly, allowing Donovan to see Cora standing behind him. "Allow me to introduce my wife, Mrs. Cole." The marriage certificate was in Emmett's hand before Donovan could object, the document pristine and official, bearing the signatures of witnesses and the seal of Reverend Mills' authority. "We were married this afternoon by Reverend Mills, with Dr. Henley and Mrs. Patterson serving as witnesses, all perfectly legal and properly recorded." Donovan snatched the certificate, his eyes scanning it for any flaw or irregularity that might invalidate it. But Reverend Mills had been thorough, and territorial law was clear about the requirements for marriage. Whatever else might be said about their hasty union, it was unquestionably legal. "This doesn't change anything," Donovan said finally, but his voice lacked its earlier certainty. "This property was legally seized for failure to meet county requirements. Marriage doesn't restore invalid claims." "Actually it does," Emmett replied, producing a second document from his coat. Territorial Statute 47. B. Clearly states that homestead rights may be restored to widows through legal marriage, provided the new husband demonstrates adequate resources for property maintenance. Cora stared at him in amazement. When had he had time to research territorial law? When had he obtained copies of the relevant statutes? Bank statement from the Cattleman's Bank of Cheyenne. Emmett continued, handing over a third paper. As you can see, I have more than sufficient funds to maintain this property according to any reasonable interpretation of county requirements. The silence stretched taut as Donovan examined the documents, his face growing redder with each passing moment. Finally, young Jake Mills cleared his throat nervously. "Sheriff, if the marriage is legal and Mr. Cole has the resources—" "Shut up, Jake." Donovan's voice was dangerous now, the veneer of legal authority beginning to crack under the pressure of thwarted greed. "I don't care what papers they've got. This property was seized legally and it stays seized." "On what grounds?" Emmett's voice remained calm, but Cora could hear steel beneath the surface. "On the grounds that I'm the sheriff, and I say so." It was the moment Cora had been dreading and anticipating in equal measure, the moment when Wade Donovan's corruption became too obvious to hide behind legal pretense. In the silence that followed his words, she could hear the wind in the bare trees and the distant lowing of cattle, but mostly she could hear the sound of a man's authority crumbling under the weight of its own dishonesty. "Tom," Emmett said quietly, addressing the older deputy. "Jake, you boys hear that? Your sheriff just admitted that he doesn't care about territorial law, doesn't care about legal documents, doesn't care about anything except his own will." Both deputies were looking everywhere except at their boss, their discomfort obvious and painful. These were young men who'd taken their jobs believing they were upholding justice, only to discover they were enforcing the whims of a petty tyrant. That's what corruption sounds like, boys. That's what it looks like when a man with a badge thinks the law doesn't apply to him. Emmett's voice was still calm, but it carried the unmistakable authority of someone who dealt with bullies before and knew exactly how to handle them. "You're under arrest," Donovan snarled, reaching for his gun. "Both of you, disturbing the peace, resisting lawful authority." "Sheriff," Dr. Henley's voice cut across the yard like a whip crack. "I wouldn't do that if I were you." All heads turned toward the road, where Dr. Henley sat on his horse with what appeared to be a rifle resting across his saddle. Behind him, barely visible in the gathering dusk, were other riders, Mrs. Patterson and her husband, Reverend Mills, and several other townspeople whose faces Cora couldn't quite make out in the fading light. "Doc?" Tom Bradley's voice was uncertain, confused by this unexpected development. "Tom, Jake, I think it's time you boys understood what's really been happening in this county," Dr. Henley said, his voice carrying the authority of age and respected position. "Time you learned the difference between enforcing the law and enabling corruption." As the riders moved closer, Cora could see that they carried not just rifles, but documents, papers that looked official and important in the lamplight spilling from the cabin windows. Whatever was happening, it had been planned, coordinated, and was now being executed with the precision of a military operation. "Sheriff Donovan," Dr. Henley continued, "by the authority vested in me as a duly appointed territorial magistrate, I'm placing you under arrest for corruption, abuse of office, and fraud. Tom, Jake, you can stand with justice or with him, but you can't stand with both." The marriage certificate in Emmett's hand suddenly seemed like only the first move in a much larger game. A game that had been playing out behind the scenes while she and Emmett were falling in love and planning their future. Cora realized that their hasty wedding hadn't just been about protecting her property or providing them with companionship, had been the catalyst for something much larger, a reckoning that had been building in Bitter Creek for months or perhaps years. The battle for her homestead was about to become a battle for the soul of the entire community. The signed marriage certificate in Emmett's hands seemed to glow in the lamplight as the standoff in Cora's yard intensified. More riders were approaching from town, not just Dr. Henley's small group, but what appeared to be half the population of Bitter Creek. their torches creating a river of flickering light against the snow-covered landscape. "This is a setup," Sheriff Donovan growled, his hand still hovering near his gun but his eyes calculating the odds as more townspeople appeared. "You planned this whole thing." "We planned to stand up for what's right," Dr. Henley replied, dismounting from his horse with the careful dignity of his 72 years. "Something we should have done months ago, before you got so comfortable thinking you could steal from widows and terrorize honest citizens." Cora felt Emmett's hand find hers, their fingers intertwining as they watched the drama unfold around them. The marriage certificate that had seemed so important moments before now felt like just one piece of a much larger puzzle, a catalyst that had triggered something the community had been building toward for months. "Doc, what's this really about?" Tom Bradley asked, his young face confused and troubled. "The sheriff said Mrs. James was trespassing." "The sheriff lied, Tom, just like he's been lying about a lot of things." Dr. Henley opened a leather satchel and withdrew a thick bundle of papers. "These are copies of territorial land records, Tom. Official documents from Cheyenne showing the legal ownership of every homestead in this county." He held up the papers for everyone to see. "According to these records, Cora and Samuel James have owned this property free and clear for 26 years. Paid every tax, met every requirement, never missed a single legal obligation." "But the sheriff said," Jake Mills started to protest. "The sheriff forged documents," Mrs. Patterson interrupted, stepping forward with her own bundle of papers. "These are copies of the fake court orders Wade Donovan has been using to seize property from people he thought were too weak to fight back. 3 homesteads in the past year, all taken on trumped-up charges, all mysteriously transferred to his name or his associates' names within weeks." Donovan's face had gone from red to purple to white as the scope of the opposition against him became clear. "You can't prove anything. Those are just papers. I have the authority." "You have the authority the territorial government gave you," Dr. Henley said firmly, "and the territorial government can take it away just as easily, especially when presented with evidence of systematic corruption." Reverend Mills urged his horse forward, his thin face set with unusual determination. "Wade, I've prayed for you. Prayed that you'd see the error of your ways and make amends before it was too late. But tonight I realize that sometimes prayer needs to be backed up with action." From the gathered crowd, other voices began to speak up. "My brother lost his farm to you last spring on fake tax charges. You threatened to arrest my oldest boy if I didn't vote for your friend in the county elections. You've been taking bribes from the railroad company to look the other way when they graze their cattle on other people's land." Each accusation hit like a physical blow, the weight of accumulated grievances finally finding voice in the safety of numbers. Cora realized that her situation hadn't been unique. She'd simply been the most recent victim of a pattern of abuse that had been growing bolder with each success. "This is still my county," Donovan said, his voice shaking with rage and something that might have been fear. "I'm still the sheriff. I still have the law on my side." "Actually, you don't." Dr. Henley pulled out one final document, this one bearing an official territorial seal. "This is a telegram from the territorial capital, Wade. Seems someone sent them a detailed report about irregularities in this county. They're sending a federal marshal to investigate, and until he arrives, I'm authorized to act as interim sheriff." The silence that followed was profound, broken only by the wind in the bare trees and the nervous shifting of horses. Cora felt the moment balanced on a knife's edge. Donovan could surrender to the inevitable, or he could try to fight his way out of a situation that was clearly beyond his control. "Tom, Jake," Donovan said finally, his voice deadly quiet. "Arrest Dr. Henley for interfering with lawful authority. Arrest all of them." But Tom Bradley was already removing his deputy's badge, his young face set with newfound resolution. "I'm sorry, Sheriff, but I can't do that. I took an oath to uphold the law, not to help break it." Jake Mills hesitated for a moment longer, clearly torn between loyalty to his boss and recognition of what was right. Then he too began unpinning his badge. "I'm with Tom, Sheriff. This isn't what I signed up for." Isolated now except for his own increasingly desperate anger, Donovan looked around the circle of torchlit faces surrounding him. "You'll regret this. All of you, when the territorial government realizes what you've done. When the territorial government realizes what we've done, they'll thank us for cleaning up a mess that was becoming an embarrassment to the whole territory." Dr. Henley replied calmly. "Wade, you have two choices. You can come quietly and take your chances with a territorial court, or you can resist and make this much worse for yourself." For a moment, Cora thought Donovan might actually draw his gun and try to shoot his way out of the situation. His hand twitched toward the weapon, his eyes darting around the crowd as if calculating whether he could take enough people with him to make the gesture worthwhile. But then his shoulders sagged, the fight going out of him as surely as air from a punctured balloon. Perhaps he finally understood that his corruption had isolated him completely, that whatever loyalty his position might once have commanded had been eroded by months of abuse and overreach. "This isn't over," he said, but the words carried no conviction. "Yes, it is," Emmett replied quietly. "It's been over since the moment you decided to steal from a grieving widow. Everything since then has just been consequences catching up with choices." As Tom Bradley and Jake Mills moved to disarm their former boss, Cora felt a wave of relief, so profound it made her legs weak. The threat that had driven her from her home, forced her into exile, and ultimately led to her hasty marriage, was finally being neutralized. But more than that, she was witnessing something she'd never expected to see an entire community, finding the courage to stand up to a bully who had seemed invincible just hours before. "Mrs. Cole," Dr. Henley said, approaching with a formal dignity that somehow made her new name feel real and permanent. "I believe this belongs to you." He handed her a rolled document tied with a Ribona new copy of her homestead deed, officially certified and bearing the territorial seal. "Your property, legally restored to you and your husband. No question of ownership, no outstanding claims, no bureaucratic complications." Cora unrolled the deed with trembling hands, reading her Namanau Cora Cole listed as lawful owner alongside Emmett's. After 3 days of uncertainty and fear, after a marriage born of desperation and hope in equal measure, she was finally home again. "What happens now?" she asked. "Now you and Emmett settle in and make a life together." Dr. Henley replied. "The federal marshal will arrive within the week to conduct his investigation, but that's not your concern anymore. Your only job is to be happy." As the crowd began to disperse, people stopping to offer congratulations and welcome Emmett to the community, Cora found herself standing in the yard where her old life had ended and her new one had begun. The cabin that had been dark and empty 3 days ago was once again filled with lamplight and the promise of shared meals and quiet evenings. The fields that had seemed barren and abandoned were once again part of a working homestead with plans for spring planting and hopes for a good harvest. "Second thoughts?" Emmett asked, echoing his question from earlier in the day. "Not about you," Cora replied, leaning into his solid warmth. "Not about us. Not about any of it." "Good, because I think we're going to be very happy together, Mrs. Cole." As they stood together in the snow-covered yard, surrounded by the detritus of her old life and the promise of their new one, Cora felt something she hadn't experienced since Samuel's death, the deep, quiet satisfaction of being exactly where she belonged, with exactly the right person at exactly the right time. The marriage certificate in Emmett's coat pocket was more than just a legal document now. It was a declaration of independence, a statement of partnership, and a promise of better days ahead. Whatever challenges the future might bring, they would face them together, as equals, as partners, as husband and wife, in the truest sense of those words. The snow continued to fall softly around them, each flake a small blessing in the crystalline air, as Bitter Creek, Wyoming, settled into what would prove to be the most peaceful night it had experienced in months. The next morning dawned crisp and clear, with the kind of brilliant winter sunshine that made every surface sparkle like scattered diamonds. Cora woke in her own bed now, for the first time in 4 days, the familiar comfort of home made new by the presence of the man sleeping quietly beside her. They had spent their wedding night in chaste companionship, talking quietly until the early hours about practical matters and shared hopes, learning the rhythms of partnership that would sustain them through whatever lay ahead. But even as she enjoyed the luxury of safety and warmth, Cora knew their troubles weren't entirely over. Wade Donovan might be in custody, but men like him rarely accepted defeat gracefully. Corrupt officials often had corrupt friends, and the network of illegal deals and fraudulent schemes that Dr. Henley had exposed would have tentacles reaching far beyond one small Wyoming town. Her concerns proved prophetic when Emmett returned from checking the animals with a troubled expression and news that set her stomach churning with familiar anxiety. 3 riders approaching from the east, he reported, hanging his coat on the peg by the door. Moving fast, and they're not locals. My guess is they're friends of our former sheriff, come to assess the situation. Cora moved to the window, shading her eyes against the snow-bright morning light. In the distance, she could see the riders Emmett had spotted, 3 men on good horses, moving with the kind of purposeful urgency that suggested business rather than a social call. Even at a distance, something about their posture and bearing struck her as vaguely threatening. What do you think they want? Same thing Donovan wanted, most likely. The difference is they're not wearing badges, which means they'll have to be more direct about their methods. 20 minutes later, the riders drew up in front of the cabin with the casual arrogance of men accustomed to getting their way through intimidation. The leader was a heavy-set man in his 40s, with the soft hands and expensive clothes of someone who made his living through schemes rather than honest work. His companions were younger, harder-looking men, whose hands rested easily on their gun belts. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole, I presume?" The leader called out without dismounting. "I'm Marcus Webb, attorney for certain business interests in this region. I understand you've had some difficulties with local law enforcement." Emmett stepped onto the porch, his manner courteous but wary. "Mr. Webb, something we can help you with?" "Actually, I'm here to help you. My clients have been monitoring the situation in Bitter Creek with some concern, particularly the recent irregularities in property transfers and law enforcement practices." Webb's smile was the practiced expression of a man who made his living convincing people to act against their own interests. "We're prepared to offer you a generous settlement for any inconvenience you may have suffered, along with fair market value for this property." "The property isn't for sale," Cora said, joining Emmett on the porch. "We just got it back." "Oh, but I think you'll find our offer quite persuasive once you understand the realities of your situation." Webb gestured toward his companions. "You see, Sheriff Donovan's irregularities have created some complex legal situations. Property that was transferred under questionable circumstances, contracts that may not be enforceable, territorial authorities who might take a very long time to sort out competing claims." The threat was politely phrased, but unmistakable. Cora felt Emmett tense beside her, his trail boss instincts, recognizing the kind of predator who preferred legal warfare to honest violence, but was perfectly willing to escalate if necessary. "What exactly are you proposing, Mr. Webb?" "I'm proposing that you accept a fair price for property that might otherwise be tied up in litigation for years. My clients are prepared to offer $5,000 cash for your homestead, to be paid immediately upon signing of the transfer documents." It was a substantial sum than most homesteaders saw in 5 years of hard work. Under other circumstances, it might have been tempting, but Cora had already learned the difference between the price of something and its value, and no amount of money could replace the life she and Samuel had built here or the future she and Emmett were planning to create. "And if we refuse?" Webb's smile became predatory. "Then you'll find yourselves embroiled in legal proceedings that could last for years. Expensive legal proceedings. The kind that tend to bankrupt small landowners even when they eventually win." "Who are your clients, Mr. Webb?" "Let's just say they're businessmen with interests in railroad development, mining rights, and large-scale cattle operations. The kind of men who think in terms of regional development rather than individual homesteads." Emmett stepped forward slightly, a subtle movement that nonetheless shifted the dynamic of the conversation. "Mr. Webb, I appreciate you riding all the way out here to make your offer, but I'm afraid we're not interested in selling. I don't think you understand the complexity of your legal situation. I understand it perfectly. You represent people who've been using Wade Donovan to steal land through fraudulent legal processes. And now that he's been exposed, you're trying to buy legitimacy for titles that won't stand up to territorial scrutiny. Webb's practiced smile faltered slightly. That's a very serious accusation, Mr. Cole. It's also an accurate one. The question is whether you're prepared to take your fraudulent business elsewhere, or whether we need to have a more pointed conversation about territorial fraud statutes and federal mail fraud laws. For the first time since arriving, Webb looked genuinely uncertain. One of his companions leaned over to whisper something in his ear, and Cora caught the word marshal in the brief exchange. Mr. Cole, you're making this more difficult than it needs to be. My clients simply want to resolve these property disputes amicably. Your clients want to profit from theft and corruption. There's nothing amicable about that. The conversation was interrupted by the sound of more horses approaching Dr. Henley and Tom Bradley, riding hard from the direction of town. As they drew up to the cabin, Cora could see papers in Dr. Henley's hand and an expression of grim satisfaction on his weathered face. "Mr. Webb," Dr. B. Henley said without preamble, "I'm surprised to see you here. Thought you'd have more pressing business in Cheyenne, considering the territorial marshal's interest in your recent activities." Webb's face went pale beneath his carefully groomed beard. "Dr. Henley, I'm simply here on legitimate business. You're here because your network of fraudulent land deals is falling apart, and you're trying to salvage what you can before the federal investigation reaches your doorstep." Dr. Henley held up the papers he'd been carrying. "These are warrants, Mr. Webb. Federal warrants for fraud, conspiracy, and racketeering. Seems the territorial government has been tracking your activities for months." The two men flanking Webb shifted nervously, their hands moving closer to their weapons. But Tom Bradley, now wearing a deputy's badge that actually meant something, had positioned himself where he could see both men clearly. "Mr. Webb," Emmett said quietly, "I think it's time for you and your associates to leave, and I think it would be wise if you didn't come back." For a moment, the situation balanced on the edge of violence. Webb's companions looked ready to fight, and Cora could see the calculation in their eyes as they weighed their chances against Emmett, Dr. Henley, and Tom Bradley. But then Webb himself seemed to deflate, recognizing that whatever game he'd been playing was over. "This isn't finished," he said, but the words lacked conviction. "Yes, it is," Dr. Henley replied firmly. "It's been finished since the moment you decided to build your fortune on other people's suffering." As the three men rode away, disappearing into the distance like a bad dream fading in daylight, Cora felt the last of her anxiety finally begin to ease. The network of corruption that had seemed so powerful and threatening was crumbling under the weight of its own contradictions, brought down by people who had simply refused to accept that might made right. "Is it really over?" she asked. "This part is," Dr. Henley assured her. "The federal marshal will clean up the rest when he arrives. Your job now is to be happy with your new husband and build the life you want together." As they watched the riders disappear into the distance, Cora felt Emmett's arm settle around her waist, solid and reassuring. The homestead that had been stolen from her was truly hers again, defended not just by legal documents, but by a community that had found the courage to stand up for what was right. The forged land grab documents that had started this whole crisis were now evidence in a federal case, their power to harm transformed into the means of their creator's downfall. The federal marshal arrived on a Tuesday morning 3 weeks later, riding into Bitter Creek with the kind of quiet authority that made Sheriff Donovan's bluster seem like the theatrical performance it had always been. Marshal James Morrison was a lean, grey-haired man in his 50s who listened more than he spoke and asked questions that revealed how much he already knew about the situation. Cora and Emmett were in town, collecting supplies, when word spread that the marshal wanted to interview everyone involved in what the territorial government was now calling the Bitter Creek incident. They found him in Dr. Henley's office, surrounded by boxes of documents and evidence that painted a comprehensive picture of corruption, extending far beyond their small community. "Mr. and Mrs. Cole," Marshal Morrison said, rising from his chair with courteous formality, "I appreciate you coming in. I understand your situation was the catalyst for exposing this network of fraud." "We were just trying to protect what was rightfully ours," Emmett replied. "Didn't know we were uncovering anything larger." "That's often how these things work. One person refuses to be victimized, and it encourages others to speak up about their own experiences." The marshal gestured toward a chair. "Mrs. Cole, I'd like you to walk me through exactly what happened, starting with your husband's death and Sheriff Donovan's first approach." For the next hour, Cora recounted the events that had transformed her from a grieving widow into a newlywed homesteader. The marshal took careful notes, occasionally asking for clarification, but mostly listening with the patient attention of someone who understood that truth emerged through details rather than dramatic declarations. "And the original deed that Sheriff Donovan destroyed, you're certain it was authentic?" "Absolutely. Samuel and I kept it in our family Bible, same place we'd kept it for 26 years. All our neighbors knew it was there." Cora paused, struck by a sudden memory. "Actually, there might be a copy." "Where?" "When we first claimed the land, Samuel was meticulous about keeping records. He made copies of all our important documents and stored them." She stopped, remembering. "In the root cellar. There's a metal box buried under the floor where he kept duplicates of everything important." Marshal Morrison leaned forward with interest. "Would you be willing to show me?" An hour later, they were at the homestead, Emmett prying up floorboards in the small root cellar behind the cabin, while Cora held a lamp and tried to remember exactly where Samuel had buried his document cache. The metal box was right where she remembered, wrapped in oiled cloth and protected from moisture by Samuel's careful planning. Inside were copies of their original homestead application, their marriage certificate, territorial tax receipts dating back 26 years, and most importantly, a notarized copy of their original deed bearing the seal of the Territorial Land Office. "This is excellent," Marshal Morrison said, examining the documents by lamplight. "These establish a clear chain of legal ownership that predates any of Donovan's fraudulent claims by decades. But even more valuable than Cora's documents were the other papers hidden in Samuel's cache records he'd kept of suspicious activities he'd witnessed over the years, including detailed notes about conversations he'd overheard between Sheriff Donovan and various businessmen regarding property transfers and development rights." "Your husband was a careful man," the marshal observed, reading through Samuel's meticulous handwriting. "These notes document a pattern of corruption going back at least 5 years. Samuel always said that truth had a way of coming to light eventually, but only if someone took the trouble to preserve it." Cora replied. "He believed in keeping records because he believed in justice." Over the following days, Samuel's hidden letters and documents proved to be the keystone evidence that brought down not just Sheriff Donovan, but the entire network of corrupt officials and fraudulent businessmen who had been systematically stealing land throughout the territory. The careful records showed how legitimate homesteaders had been targeted, how fraudulent documents had been created, and how stolen property had been transferred to shell companies controlled by Webb and his associates. 23 fraudulent seizures over 5 years, Marshal Morrison reported during a community meeting at the church. Property worth an estimated $50,000, stolen from legitimate owners through forged documents and abuse of official authority. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. Donovan hadn't been working alone. He'd been part of a territorial-wide scheme involving corrupt sheriffs, fraudulent attorneys, and unscrupulous businessmen who specialized in stealing land from people they thought were too weak or isolated to fight back. "What happens to the people who lost their property?" Mrs. Patterson asked. "Every legitimate claim will be restored. The territorial government is establishing a special court to hear appeals and reverse fraudulent seizures. People who were driven off their land will be compensated, and their property rights will be restored." "And Donovan?" Sheriff Donovan will be tried in federal court on charges of fraud, conspiracy, extortion, and violation of civil rights. If convicted, he faces 20 years in territorial prison. The marshal's voice was grim but satisfied. Mr. Webb and his associates faced similar charges. As the meeting concluded and people began filing out into the evening air, Cora felt a deep sense of completion that went beyond personal vindication. Samuel's patient record-keeping had not only protected their property, but had helped expose a system of corruption that had been victimizing innocent people throughout the territory. His quiet commitment to truth and justice had outlived him, becoming the foundation for a reckoning he'd never lived to see. He would have been proud, Emmett said quietly as they walked home through the snow-covered streets. He would have been amazed. Samuel always believed in doing the right thing, but I don't think he ever imagined his notes would bring down a territorial conspiracy. Maybe that's the point. Maybe the most important acts of courage are the quiet ones, the daily choices to pay attention and keep records and tell the truth, even when no one seems to be listening. That night, as they sat before their fire reading the newspaper accounts of the scandal that was already being called the largest territorial fraud case in Wyoming history, Cora reflected on the strange chain of events that had brought her from exile to vindication. Her refusal to marry Sheriff Donovan had seemed like a simple matter of personal dignity at the time, but it had triggered a sequence of revelations that had exposed corruption affecting hundreds of people across thousands of square miles. "Do you ever wonder what would have happened if you hadn't found me on that road?" she asked Emmett. "I try not to think about it, but I suspect you would have found a way to fight back eventually. You're not the kind of woman who stays defeated." I felt pretty defeated that night in the blizzard. Feeling defeated isn't the same as being defeated. You kept walking, kept moving toward some kind of solution, even when you couldn't see what it might be. That's courage, Cora. The real kind. As they prepared for bed, Cora carefully placed Samuel's hidden letters back in their metal box, but this time she stored it in their bedroom closet rather than burying it in the root cellar. The documents had served their purpose in exposing corruption, but they would continue to serve as a reminder of Samuel's legacy and the importance of bearing witness to truth. The final piece of evidence had been found, the last of the conspirators had been arrested, and justice was finally being served. But more than that, a community had rediscovered its capacity for collective courage, and two lonely people had found unexpected love in the midst of crisis. Outside their window, snow continued to fall on the Wyoming landscape, each flake a small blessing in the crystalline air, covering the scars of corruption with the promise of spring renewal. Spring came early to Bitter Creek that year, arriving in March with the kind of gentle warmth that made winter seem like a distant memory rather than a recent ordeal. Cora stood in her garden, their garden, now watching Emmett guide the plow horse through furrows that would soon hold the season's first crops. The sight filled her with a contentment she hadn't expected to feel again, the deep satisfaction of shared work and shared dreams, taking root in familiar soil. 6 months had passed since their hasty wedding, 6 months during which their practical partnership had gradually transformed into something deeper and more enduring than either had dared hope. It hadn't happened all at once. There had been no sudden declaration of love, no dramatic moment of recognition. Instead, it had grown quietly through daily kindnesses, shared laughter, and the countless small intimacies of two people learning to build a life together. "Mrs. Cole." The voice calling from the road belonged to Tom Bradley, now serving as Bitter Creek's sheriff under the territorial government's reorganization of local law enforcement. He rode up to the fence with the easy confidence of a young man who'd found his proper place in the world. "Got some news I thought you'd want to hear." "Good news, I hope," Cora replied, setting down her basket of seed packets and walking over to meet him. "The best. Just got word from Sheriff Wade Donovan was convicted on all charges. 25 years in territorial prison, and he'll never be eligible for any kind of law enforcement position again." "And Marcus Webb?" 15 years, plus he has to pay restitution to all the families whose land was stolen. Turns out he kept meticulous records of his illegal activities, made the prosecutor's job a lot easier. Emmett had stopped his ploughing and was walking over to join the conversation, his face weather-beaten but peaceful in the way of a man who'd finally found where he belonged. At 61, he moved with the careful economy of age, but also with the contentment of someone no longer fighting against his circumstances. "Any word on when the other families will get their property back?" he asked. "Most of them already have. The Hendersons got their place back last month, and the Mackenzies are moving back to their homestead next week. Territorial courts been working through the cases pretty quickly once they had all of Samuel's documentation to work from." The mention of Samuel's name brought the familiar mix of sadness and gratitude that Cora had learned to accept as part of her daily emotional landscape. Her first husband's careful record-keeping had not only protected their own property, but had provided the foundation for restoring justice to dozens of other families. It was a legacy that felt entirely fitting for a man who'd believed in the quiet power of doing right. "There's something else," Tom added, his young face brightening with obvious pleasure. "The territorial government is naming the new county courthouse after Samuel James. They're calling it the Samuel James Memorial Courthouse in recognition of his service to justice and community welfare." Cora felt tears spring to her eyes knot, the bitter tears of grief that had characterized the early months of her widowhood, but the sweet tears that came from seeing love honored and remembered in meaningful ways. He would have been so pleased, not for the recognition, but because it means his work helped other people. "Dr. Henley says they're planning a dedication ceremony this summer, if you'd be willing to speak about Samuel's character and his commitment to truth." "I'd be honored." As Tom rode away to deliver his news to other families affected by the corruption scandal, Cora and Emmett stood together in the warm spring sunshine, looking out over land that was finally, unquestionably, legally and permanently theirs. The homestead that had been stolen, fought for, and reclaimed was now the foundation for a future that neither could have imagined during those desperate winter days when they'd first met. "Regrets?" Emmett asked, the question that had become a gentle ritual between them. "None," Cora replied, as she always did. "You?" "Only that we didn't meet sooner." It was a sweet sentiment, but Cora knew it wasn't entirely true. They had met exactly when they were supposed to meet, when both were ready for the kind of love that was built on mutual respect and shared experience rather than passion and promise. Young love was beautiful in its own way, but there was something to be said for the love that came to people who understood loss, who valued partnership, and who could appreciate the gift of companionship without demanding more than life could reasonably provide. That evening, as they sat on their porch watching the sun set over the Wyoming landscape, Cora reached into her apron pocket and withdrew 2 simple gold band's new wedding rings that they'd ordered from the jeweler in Cheyenne, symbols of their choice to make their practical marriage into a love match. "I was thinking," she said, holding up the rings so they caught the fading light, "maybe it's time we made this official." Emmett smiled, the expression transforming his weathered features with a warmth that reminded her why she'd fallen in love with him gradually, day by day, through the accumulation of small kindnesses and shared dreams. "I thought we already did that. We made it legal, but maybe it's time we made it intentional." They had talked about this possibility over the winter months, the idea of renewing their vows, not because their marriage was in trouble, but because they wanted to acknowledge how much it had grown beyond its practical origins. The woman who had married Emmett Cole out of desperation and mutual need was gone, replaced by someone who chose him freely, joyfully, and completely. "What did you have in mind?" "Same church, same reverend, same witnesses, but this time we say the words because we mean them, not because circumstances require them." Emmett took one of the rings from her palm, examining it in the golden light of sunset. "Mrs. Cole, are you proposing to me?" "I suppose I am, Mr. Cole. Are you accepting?" "Depends. Are you marrying me for my money this time?" Cora laughed, the sound carrying across the peaceful evening air like music. "No, I'm marrying you because you make me laugh, because you listen when I talk about Samuel without getting jealous." Because you're teaching me that love doesn't have to be the same thing twice to be real both times. In that case, yes, I accept your proposal. As they sat together watching the stars appear in the darkening sky, Cora reflected on the unexpected journey that had brought her from exile to homecoming, from desperation to joy, from the end of one love story to the beginning of another. The road had been hard, marked by loss and injustice, and the kind of winter cold that tested the spirit as much as the body. But it had also been marked by unexpected kindness, by the courage of people who chose to stand up for what was right, and by the discovery that love could return when it seemed long past. The quilt that had wrapped her during her flight through the blizzard now covered their marriage bed. The homestead that had been stolen was now the foundation for new dreams. The community that had seemed powerless against corruption had found its collective voice and used it to demand justice. Most importantly, two people who had thought their chances for happiness were behind them had discovered that life's best gifts sometimes came disguised as its worst trials. Their marriage had begun as a practical solution to an impossible problem, but it had become something neither had dared hope, for a true partnership between equals who understood the value of what they'd found together. "Ready to go inside, Mrs. Cole?" "Ready, Mr. Cole."